Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at one part of the nervous system, and in particular we're going to have a look at the central nervous system right here, right? And so that's going to have be comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. So we're going to take a look at mostly the anatomy, particularly of the brain, but as well we're going to look at some of the different functional aspects of each of those regions. Okay, so the brain, right, is made up of four different sections. Right, so the four sections are the cerebrum. So this is one half of the cerebrum. So there's two sides of basically a left and a right hemisphere. So this is called the cerebral hemisphere, but as a whole, right, it's called the cerebrum. There. Right, and this is what you would typically think of when you think of the brain itself. This is the largest component, takes up the most mass. Over 80% of the mass of the brain comes from the cerebrum. So it's the large component here, right? So the cerebrum is all of this around here, right? So that gray component, or you see on the outside, is the cerebrum. We also have the diencephalon, right? So the diencephalon is this internal structure here, right? So that one around here, there's the diencephalon, and we'll take a look at that later. That's composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Attached to the diencephalon, so just inferior, excuse me, we have the brainstem, right? So the diencephalon. Here we have the brainstem. So the brainstem is composed of these three sections here. We'll take a look at those individually coming up, but just as a whole, so the brainstem is this component here, right? That's going to come down there. And finally, we have the cerebellum, right? So the cerebellum is this posterior, inferior aspect of the brain, which runs around there, right? So we have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum as our four main sections of the brain. So now we're going to take a look at each of these in a little bit more detail. Okay, so when we see the cerebrum for the first time, right, the first thing that we notice is the kind of this wrinkly aspect of it. So this here is basically a front section of a brain sliced in half, right? So if we were to take this brain here, and say we were to take a slice here, and we were to look then at the front of that slice, that's what we'd be looking at right here. Right, and so like I said, the first thing you notice is this kind of this wrinkly aspect to it, right? So we have some kind of bumps there, some grooves there, right? And so what these are called, so the bumps themselves are called a gyri, right, as a whole. So the bumps are the gyri. Individually, right? So these individual bumps, these are called the gyrus. So that's a gyrus, the bumpy part. And then in between, so kind of what makes up the gyrus, the groove in between the gyri, is the sulcus, right? So we have these sulci as a plural here. But so in between the gyri, we have a sulcus. Right, and the most leading, I guess, theory, if you will, on why we have these folds is to increase the surface area. Right, so when we have this folding in, right, we're able to fit a lot more material within these folds instead of if it were just smooth all the way around. Okay, so the cerebrum, right, aside from the kind of the bumps and the grooves that we see here, are made up of three main components. Right, so the first thing that we're going to have a look at is the cortex. Right, so the cortex is basically the gray matter. Right, so this dark gray matter here within the outer edge of the cerebrum. Right, and so we'll notice here that this cortex, so that's going to be the gray area here. Never noticed if I should spell it with an A or an E, so I'll follow the textbook and go with an A. Right, so the cortex is that gray matter around the outside there. So this is actually what makes up the conscious mind, if you will. Right, so this is where consciousness basically comes from, is where it's processed and basically delivered is through this gray matter, the cortex of the cerebrum. And so what makes it gray, right, is this is actually the cell bodies and the dendrites of our neurons. Remember, the neurons are the cells of the nervous system, right, and they contain cell bodies and dendrites, which are those extensions that receive information. They have a very long axon that sends a signal away from the body, away from the cell body, right? So the gray matter here is actually just the cell bodies and the dendrites. So we'll have cell body here, some of the dendrites there, another cell body there, dendrite there. So cell bodies of these neurons. What actually makes it gray, right, are the different nuclei, right? So the nucleus, remember, is that really dark, the dark visible component of a cell body, right? And so we see that that makes the gray matter. And so there's no axons that are within the gray matter. So the cortex does not contain any axons, right? The axons actually are what make up the white matter, right? So the white matter are basically the axons, right, that are myelinated. So if you remember from last class, we talked about myelination of the axons, where there's that like that fatty sort of blanket over top of the axons, right? And so it's that myelin sheath that makes up the white matter. One of the more interesting features is that the axons cross over, and so you may have heard this fact before, that basically the left hemisphere of your brain controls the right side of your body, right? And that's actually because the axons would come across and they cross over. So the axons that start on the right side come down and cross over into the left side of the body. Just a little, kind of a bit of a fun fact there. Right, and so staying with the white matter, right, so really the main purpose of the white matter is to communicate between the cerebrum and other parts of the brain, right? So the white matter is able to send information to different parts of the brain, as well as send information from, say, like the thalamus, or the hypothalamus. And the last piece that we're going to take a little bit of another look at on the next slide here are called the basal nuclei, and you might also see it as basal ganglia. Right, so you have basal ganglia or basal nuclei. Right, and again, so the basal nuclei are these areas of gray matter. So it's gray here, and so we can see a little bit of it here. So all of these patches of gray that we see around here, right, that's called the basal nuclei. And so just to have a little bit of of a closer look. So we can see, so you see here, right, in the drawing. So again, we have that same frontal plane view. You see a little bit of them here. We even see them a little bit quite distinct in a cadaveric brain, right? So even with the different folds, different sulci and gyri of the cerebrum, right, of the cortex. So you can see the gray matter here, the white matter, and we can see, right, the basal nuclei around here. So those gray patches there, right, are part of the basal nuclei. And here in this image, you can actually see where that crossover occurs, right? So you get what's called that contralateral control. So contralateral means opposite side, right? So you have here on the right side, right, coming through and crossing over to the left side. Here you have the left side crossing over to the right side. So that left-right cross is what gives you the contralateral control. Anyway, back to the basal nuclei here, right? So the primary function of the basal ganglia, so you can see here, right, it's located kind of centrally in the cerebrum. So we take that cross section, we're right in the middle here, and again, because it's gray matter, right, it's going to contain the cell bodies, right? So there's no axons within the basal nuclei, right? And this is again, it helps coordinate brain function, right? So what we mean by that is it filters basically any of the motor signals coming in to make sure any, say, incorrect or erroneous signals are filtered out, and it provides this smooth motion, right? And so basically, instead of having like stop and go jerky motion, the basal nuclei helps filter and smooth out the signal coming in to allow for fluid motion. So a classic example of what happens when there's dysfunction or a disorder of the basal nuclei is in Parkinson's disease, right? And so you might see one of the telltale signs of Parkinson's is shaking, right? So you have a lot of unnecessary movements. It's hard to walk smoothly. You might there's a lot of shuffling of the feet during walking with Parkinson's, and so it's a disorder of the basal nuclei. So you're not getting that filtering of the signal to help smooth out what's going on there, right? And so between the cortex, the white matter, and the basal nuclei, those components make up the cerebrum there.